many stories out there of strength, resilience, and courage, and we're on a mission to bring them all to you. Welcome to Empowered Voices Amplified. Our guest today is Kara Cook, and I'm really excited about the conversation we're about to have. Kara is the CEO of Basic Rights Queensland and Working Women Queensland. She has been an advocate and voice for those who need it most throughout her career, which has spanned across law, politics, and community services. Her skill set is unique with expertise in community campaigning and advocacy, domestic violence, women's issues, law reform, policy, fundraising, communication, and media. She is a former, or as she likes to say it, reformed politician, founded Australia's first expert domestic violence law firm, has worked as the principal lawyer at Women's Legal Service Queensland, is a former vice president of Queensland Law Society and Australian Young Lawyer of the Year. Welcome to the show, Cara.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That is really impressive. How do you feel when you look at all the things that you've done over the years?
I feel quite old, to be quite honest with you, because in amongst all of that, I've also managed to have 3 children and obviously, go through all of the life changes that come with that. But also, it is nice to reflect sometimes because I think when you're on the train and on the journey, sometimes you don't stop to look back and see where you've travelled and how things have sort of brought you to where you are today. So it is nice to hear those things because it's not something that I sit down and think about often. I often am very much in the place that I am and just trying to move forward all the time. So I think reflection is valuable and a very good thing to do, but I probably don't do it often enough.
Well, you are currently the CEO of Basic Rights Queensland, and we've just spoken about, reflection, your journey, all of that. What do you think has really contributed to you being where you are now?
In some ways, I feel like my new position with Basic Rights is a bit of a culmination of my other jobs and journey to date. So, having a background in law, that was my first degree, law, and I also did a degree in business management. And I felt like I was always drawn to both law and business for different reasons. And law certainly was around having impact, helping others, doing that side of, I guess, my core values. And then the business management side, I was always just really interested in business and people and how you sort of make a business tick. And I feel like I've finally now got to a position where I get to do the best of both worlds. Basic Rights is a community legal centre, so I'm able to still touch the law without practicing the law. So it's a really unique and lovely position to be in. And then getting the opportunity now to really, I guess, prove myself in some ways and demonstrate that I also do have those managerial skills and running an organisation and thinking about financials and strategy and dealing with a board and all of those things that some lawyers never get to experience. So I just feel really lucky to have the opportunity now to use both of those skill sets, culminating in this position.
Best of both worlds?
Best of both worlds.
You said you did both law and business management. Is there any reason why you studied two distinct? Because it's interesting to connect the two of them, but was there anything that triggered that study journey?
Oh, look, I was always really interested in helping others. Even as a young child, I grew up in a very small regional town in Queensland, central Queensland, and I was very involved in the local community, was always interested in fundraising and supporting people who needed help. And I feel like I just kept following that path. And as opportunities came up, I found myself more and more drawn to trying to understand how the law worked, how the legal system worked, how you could use the law to help people with their problems, and the value of education. And that for some people who didn't have those education opportunities that I had had, I was in a really privileged position to be able to help them with some of those issues. So I just kept following that feeling, I guess. And I ended up studying law. And when I did start studying law, I think I was a little bit surprised that I guess it wasn't quite what I expected. It was very, a lot of books and a lot of
Yeah.
reading and not as exciting as what I saw on TV. And and studies always been a bit of a struggle for me. I wouldn't call myself an academic student. I wasn't disciplined in that way. I was never the top student in the class or anything like that, but I was very much like the little engine that could. I just kept going. And I knew that when I came to subjects that I didn't particularly enjoy, like, constitutional law and things like that, I just knew I had to get through them to get to my end goal. And I was one of those students who got to the end and knew I would be really good once I was out in the real world and talking to real
Mm,
people. I was street smart, I guess, not as much book
mm,
smart, but I got there in the end, and I really found that my law degree just gave me a really unique way of thinking and a problem solving set of
mm,
skills that I'm not sure many other degrees give you and teach
mm.
you how to think in a certain way. And I've really enjoyed using those skills and applying them to different things, politics included.
While we're on politics, so in January, there was a news headline in Brisbane Times. Labour's only female Brisbane councillor, the party's deputy leader, Cara Cook, has announced a resignation, which she held for more than 5 years. What are you most proud of in the 5 years you were in that position?
Being in council was a pretty unique role, and it was interesting because during that 5 years I was in the opposition. So in Brisbane City Council, we have an administration and an opposition, and I was in the opposition. There were only five of us, and so we didn't have a lot of power, which was an interesting position to be in,
Mhm,
to make decisions that affected the city in a traditional way. But what we did have was our voices and the voices of our community. And through that process of learning about politics and learning about advocacy and community engagement, I found, I guess, my own voice and the voice of my community in a way to really amplify it so that I could actually have impact despite being in opposition. And whether or not that was using community campaigns or petitions or going and talking with the media about different issues, sometimes on a weekly basis, just to try and get that voice heard by the people who needed to hear it so that those who were with the power, with the decision making power, could help and make decisions that were favourable to the types of issues we were advocating for. So, an example of that is Brisbane never had a domestic violence strategy for the city, and that I knew that there were other cities around Australia and certainly around the world that had implemented policy and procedure within their local councils to make sure that domestic violence was a priority, not just for one level of government, but for all levels of government. And there are things that everyone can do to make a difference when it comes to domestic violence. So I brought a motion to the chamber and argued that Brisbane should have a domestic violence strategy, and the media were there and they were reporting on it, and there was a vote. And ultimately, the whole chamber supported that motion. And now Brisbane does have a domestic violence strategy for the city. And I was really proud to initiate that
mm,
because domestic violence was something that I had worked in that space. I was very passionate about. And it was a really great way of bringing the skills and experience that I had had outside of politics,
mm.
as in that legal realm, into that political space to have greater community impact. So it really felt like a proud moment, but also, again, just culminating those skills and building on my skills to enable me to do something that could have impact to so many other people.
That was a big one. So when it was, I'm going back to what we spoke about reflection, and because when you're moving so quickly, it's hard to actually sit down and think of everything that you've done to a point. But this was quite huge.
It was, and in the time, as it was unfolding, I'm
Mm,
not sure I fully comprehended the importance of it. And as far as I know, it was the first time that an opposition councillor had brought a motion that everyone had supported in that way,
wow.
because council is quite a structured process and procedure,
Mm,
and it is difficult, very difficult from opposition to get any sort of traction or movement on these sorts of issues. So to get
mm,
that upon reflection was a really big thing to achieve,
uh-huh.
but it was also really important for the city. And then at a later date, I did another motion that was around a homelessness strategy as well.
Mm.
And that motion was successful as well. So that is still in progress, that policy. And obviously, I'm no longer in council, but there was the opportunity to bring those really big issues to the council and make sure that those people who generally wouldn't have a voice in that chamber were seen.
Wow. I'm blown away. I feel like we could talk about this for we could talk about this the whole afternoon. Something interesting that I read was that you were the only female Labour councillor in Brisbane City Council. And, when I think we are in 2023, or, my expectations are that we don't hear first woman anymore, or even first person of color in my case. Why do you think, in a minute, it's taken a while for women to integrate into politics or for women to be in recognizable senior leadership positions?
Mm. I think that there's lots of structural barriers for women still that exist. And it's interesting in politics, we've seen the Labor Party, for example, has implemented a policy around making sure that there are 50% of women in winnable seats so that we are ensuring that those numbers increase. And I honestly think without that kind of policy, we wouldn't have seen the change that we have seen. Certainly, me being the only Labor councillor at that time, now, since I have left, so that's just in a few short months, as a result of those affirmative action policies, when other councillors have left, they've been replaced by women.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, so
Yeah.
now, today in Brisbane City Council, there are two female councillors. And that is, of course, on their merits, they've got those positions, but
Yes.
also they were required to be held by women. And there is no guarantee that if that policy wasn't there, that would have been the outcome.
Yeah.
So I'm a pretty firm believer in quotas, in targets. I think
Mm.
that they can make a real difference, not just for women, but for other minority groups as well. And
Mm.
I think we've come a long way in terms of seeing more women in these positions, but we certainly have not come a long way in seeing other diversity in these positions. And
Mm.
so there is a lot of work to do. And I think it is for organisations, for politicians to really think about who needs to be at those tables. And I would
Mm.
say it is everyone. It is everyone that needs to be at those tables. It needs to be a broad and diverse table of people, and it simply is not currently.
Mm. I like what you said about quotas, because I read somewhere where there was a huge debate about inclusivity and diversity. And one of the people who commented, a man, said, "Why should we compromise? Why should we compromise?" And it fascinated me that when people think diversity, they naturally think there's a compromise going on. So, in
Instead
your
of instead of an enhancement or a richness or
yes.
creating a better outcome by having more voices at the table and more diversity of views, I agree. It seems crazy to see that as taking away instead of actually enhancing everyone's experience. I absolutely agree.
Exactly. And it's one of those things where you've got, if we're talking about diversity, we're not saying just put people in positions, as you rightfully said, it's merit. But there has to be a way in which people are given a chance. We know that women don't apply to positions if they don't tick all the boxes. But if it's specific to women, we know you will get someone who has the merit to sit on that table. So, yeah, that's very interesting. I like that you mentioned that
Mm,
it just
mm,
triggered that post that I read on LinkedIn.
mm.
So, speaking of inclusivity, in 2020, during the pandemic, the council was criticized for not allowing you were pregnant at the time, to attend meetings virtually. Do you think that since then there's been a deliberate shift and, a change in policy that is more inclusive?
Absolutely. That was a big fight to have at the time. And I just couldn't understand why we were able to all facilitate online meetings during that period through COVID, and that we would automatically just flip back to not being able to facilitate them
Mm.
post COVID. And ultimately, I had to have that fight in a very public way, which was not particularly enjoyable or comfortable for me personally. But I really felt strongly about the fact that it wasn't about just me at that point. It was about anyone else who was going to be pregnant and come into that place. It was going to be about ensuring that, people who may not otherwise be able bodied and able to attend the chamber, that they would be able to attend. If people had caring responsibilities for elderly parents, that they could attend. It just felt like the right thing to do. And to have that change now means that I hope we will see greater diversity, and I hope that people will put their hand up knowing that that barrier of physically being required to be there is removed. They can still participate, they can still be just as involved and active as someone who is physically present in that chamber, but removing that barrier to me was a really big change, of course, for an institution that was very set in its ways. But ultimately, again, the richness for greater diversity in that group and to represent the city of Brisbane, I think it was a worthwhile change and one that I'm really proud to have played at least a small role in.
You say a small role, but in everything that I've seen, everything that you've worked on and what you've fought for, there's this great fight towards equality and fairness.
Mm.
So if we're talking homelessness, if we're talking domestic violence, and now we're talking about representation, for pregnant women, what is it that drives you to fight for to fight for I'll use this term because we use it a lot, right? To fight for the little guy, to fight for someone who doesn't have a voice.
Mm.
What
Mm.
drives you? Because it's not popular.
No, I don't know. I've just always had this really strong core sense of justice.
Mm,
I really feel, I have a lot of empathy, I think, for people, but just particularly for people who are most vulnerable. And when I had my law firm, I did a lot of fundraising for Pets in Crisis, which was a domestic violence charity which helped house pets of women who were escaping domestic violence relationships, because we knew it was a really
mm,
big barrier to people leaving, was having to leave their pets. And I just feel like, animals are incredibly vulnerable, children are
mm,
incredibly vulnerable, women trying to leave these domestic violence situations, those who are homeless. I mean, there are big cohorts of people in our society who just really need that advocacy and support and help. And I just feel like with my skills and abilities, there is no more worthwhile cause than to be advancing the interests
mm,
of those who can't. And I selfishly, I think I personally get a lot of reward from doing that sort of work.
mm,
It makes me feel really satisfied with how I live my life, and that what I'm doing is consistent with my core values. So I think it's just a really closely held, strong personal drive that comes from that sense of justice and not wanting to see inequality. And when I do see it, I just can't help myself. I just have to
mm,
get involved. Yeah. I hope that they're exactly the same sorts of principles and values that I will instill in my own children, so that
mm.
they can have that drive and that sense of purpose to help in their lives
It
well.
it really is impressive, Cara, because at times we would, like, natural human instinct, you want to fight a fight that doesn't make you unpopular,
Mm.
but with with the things that you've had to publicly stand for, it takes a lot. So really appreciate that. And speaking of publicity and things that are done in the public space, there's a time someone helped you, a man helped you push your broken down car off the road, and you posted about it on social media. There was one particular comment, one
Yes.
particular comment, and can you talk me through that? And I want to explore that a little bit because you've worked in domestic violence space, and I believe violence is not only physical but can be verbal and emotional. How that comment made you feel, and how as women we should stand up to such comments, particularly on social media and at work.
Yes, that situation was pretty unique because
Mm,
I guess sometimes you find yourself in these situations where you think one thing and then you post about it and you don't expect to get a response like I did on that particular day. And the comment was words along the lines of, did you give him a BJ as a thank you? And I remember I'd come home and I looked at that comment and I remember thinking to myself, really? Really?
Mm, mm.
This is where we're at. This is where we're at in society
That's shocking.
in 2023. And I turned to my husband and I said to him, look at this, have a look at this. What do you think about
Mm,
this? And he said, oh, you've got to call that out. This is
mm,
just not appropriate. And I ummed and ahed over it for a little bit and I thought, no, you know what, you're right. And I
mm,
did. I posted about it and I just said, this is just not okay. What is it? And I did think about that a lot. I thought, is this something about me as a person? Is it something about women more broadly?
mm,
Why did this man feel that sense of entitlement to post that comment at that time? And I did call him out and, he promptly disappeared. But
oh,
I just, again, I was faced with that fork in the road. You think, do you call it out? Do you go away quietly?
mm,
What would I sort of say to someone else if it wasn't me in that situation? And my advice, I think, always is if you feel comfortable and confident enough to call it out, because it's never going to be an easy journey. And even when I
mm.
did call it out, of course, I received other hurtful comments and messages. But ultimately, we have to live with ourselves, don't we? And we have to
Yes.
live with our personal values and ethics. And I really felt that I wouldn't feel comfortable not saying something.
Mm,
And that is what I did. And I got a lot of support from people and a lot of women sharing their own stories of what they had experienced. And it is sad to say, but yes, it's 2023, but those cultural, I call it sort of cultural practices, I guess,
mm,
within Australian society, and those norms around how we treat women and the lack of respect we have for women are still very strong. And there is a lot of work to do to make sure that even young children are
mm,
educated from a very early age about respect and what is
yeah,
respect and what is a respectful relationship. And this then feeds into all we know around domestic violence, and basing those relationships should be, we want to see relationships founded in respect,
mhm.
and domestic violence relationships are not.
When I saw that, and I was going through this with my usual co host, Sandra, and our jaws literally just dropped. I could not believe this is a comment I would think you'd see in the 60s, maybe, or even 50s, but not in this day and age. Not on a, it's just, it's unbelievable. But speaking of which, what actionable advice or tips would you have for women who want to be in politics or leadership positions in Australia, particularly with everything that you've faced and have had to fight? What would be some of the key tips you'd give?
I think finding some very good mentors and supporters, and as you travel your journey, you'll come across people who are aligned in their values and beliefs. And if you can find those people and hold on to them, you'll pick them up along the way. And I've certainly done that across different positions that I've held. And there's still people today that I go to for advice and feedback. And I find that really valuable and very grounding as well, especially people who have traveled with you on the journey. And so that's something I think everyone can do. Also, having that real thirst for knowledge and trying to expand your learning where you can. Certainly for myself, when there have been different courses or programs or conferences that have come up that are again, kind of aligned, or sometimes not as aligned with what I think I should be interested in. Sometimes stretching yourself a little bit in different directions can be good. So I do encourage people as well just to, take that kind of lifelong learning approach and really taking opportunities and just having a go. We all have that level of self-doubt and not knowing if we're capable or qualified or tick all the boxes, all of those things.
Mm,
Every person, well, every woman at least, I should say, that I know
yeah.
has had those doubts, and you actually just have to keep pushing forward, because if there's something that you really want to achieve, the path to doing that is often not a straight one. It's windy and twisty, and
Mm,
and
mm,
takes you on all sorts of weird and wonderful adventures. And sometimes just having the strength and courage to put your hand up can really pay off. And certainly I've tried to do that when I've had those doubts. I've just kept trying to push forward, and it has worked, but you've got to find those people, those mentors and supporters that will help you along the way as well.
I like what you mentioned about it's not a straight path, because
No.
at times we can look at someone's achievements and just think, oh, they're so lucky, because in our minds it's just a straight, incline to success. So yeah, I really like that. If you reflect on your journey and all the work that you've done, what work do you think needs to be like what more needs to be done to make Australia more inclusive in the boardroom, in senior leadership, in politics, particularly for women from diverse ethnic backgrounds? And this is a completely selfish question from me.
Mm. Oh, look, I honestly believe that quotas, targets,
Mm,
making a really conscientious effort to include people who are not at the table is critical. And someone said to me recently, if you work in a business or in a company or in a political party and you look around the room and you are running a campaign or need to do a group photo or something like that, and you look around the room, and if you can't speak to the groups of people and the diversity of people that you need to with the people in your team, then you need to change. If you can't use your
wow.
team in those sorts of campaigns, then that's a problem. And I think there are a lot of people who would look around and go, oh, this isn't looking as diverse as it should or as inclusive as it should. And we all have the ability, again, at different levels within our workplaces, within our homes, within our communities, have the ability to affect that little ripple change that then grows and gains momentum. So I do think there's that, just being very conscious about what you're doing, how you're doing, who is around you, why. But I do think having policies, targets, quotas is the way to build those numbers, because it will not just happen organically. It
Hmm.
just won't. And certainly if it does happen organically, it's going to take a very, very, very long time. And you just have to look at some of the numbers. I mean, particularly even in the legal profession, my husband and I both have a scholarship to support students at Griffith University, female
Mm,
Indigenous law students, because we looked around, particularly at the bar in Queensland, at the number of barristers, and we looked at out of thousands of barristers in Queensland, there are 2 female Indigenous barristers in Queensland.
two.
And 2. And we thought,
Ah,
that's not good enough.
mm-mm.
What can we do? We need to see more female Indigenous law students supported, not just through their degree, but then supported to take that next step to get to the bar. And so we
Wow.
proactively not just provide financial support, but also mentoring, networks,
Mm,
those things I spoke about earlier,
yeah.
to make sure that people are supported to get there, because that is not going to change organically when you just have.
Two. Wow. Again in 2023. Oh, Cara, what motivates you to keep pushing forward? Because this work that you do is challenging. The spaces that you're in are, it's all challenging. But what keeps you inspired and empowered to continue this journey?
I think just the ability to have an impact. I know that I have some unique skills, and I want to use them to really make the world a better place for other people. I think that's at its core. And now having my own family, I think too, just knowing that my own children who are First Nations kids, I want them to grow up in a world that is better for them as well, and better for everyone, and that we all, I guess, in it together, but I want to see them succeed and have the same opportunities as every other child.
I'll go back to this comment someone once made when I asked on diversity, and the response I got was that Australia is a country of equal opportunities, so everyone has a fair go. I think that's a very popular saying. What's your take on that?
I think Australia should be a country where everyone has a fair go. I would say that right now that you have to recognise that there are groups of people who aren't getting a fair go. And
Mm,
I think recognising the difference between equality and equity. Equity is what I'm about, is recognising difference and recognising that we need to actually bring others up and lift them up so that they are on par. But that takes recognition of difference as well, and inequality. So I would say there is not an equal par in our country currently, but we certainly should work towards it. And I want to see see everyone have a fair go.
Definitely should work towards it. I do appreciate Kara for, for joining us on Empowered Voices Amplified. This has been a really great discussion, and I can't wait for, to get feedback from our listeners on how they found the episode. And if anyone's listened to this and has questions or anything they'd like to contribute, feel free to send us an email and we will be happy to pick up the discussion. Thank you again, Kara, for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me.